In the offices of the Daily Bugle, Betty Brandt, secretary/personal assistant to editor and publisher J. Jonah Jameson, was writing herd on a typical day of barely controlled insanity. Jonah was in one of his moods, which was to be expected since it was a day ending in the letter Y. Just to make Betty's life even more exciting, Jonah's recent physical had not been a happy experience. Jameson's wife had provided Betty with a list of things that Jonah should avoid, according to doctor's orders. The word stress was at the top, triple underlined. Betty had laughed uncontrollably until she realized that Mrs. Jameson was dead serious. Betty pointed out that, in her defense, Jonah's wife had unwisely chosen to present the list on April 1st, and Betty had reasonably concluded it was a joke. So now Betty was the official and unwilling monitor of Jonah's food and mood, and was starting to think that she should ask for a raise that was commensurate with what was being expected of her, like, say, $1 million a year. Ted Hoffman, the much-beleaguered head of promotion, strode towards Betty's desk with the jaunty manner he always exhibited before going in to see Jameson, a direct contrast to the way he typically acted upon departing. "Boss is gonna love this campaign," he announced as he breezed past. Betty was always impressed. Hoffman was like that boppin' bag she had as a kid. You know, the 4-foot-high inflatable punching toy with the weighted bottom and the clown face painted on. No matter how hard you slugged it, it would always roll back to standing and have that same determined smile. That was Hoffman. However many times Jameson flattened him, he rolled with it and came right back next time for more abuse. Moments later, the fast-moving form of Eddie Brock tried to make it past Betty's desk. He had a portfolio tucked under his arm, as if his going to Jameson's office were a done deal. He said chipperly, "Hey, Betty, Bo Betty." Betty generally tried to be as accommodating as possible, but in Brock's short time with the newspaper, he had gotten under Betty's skin with amazing ease. The most aggravating thing was that he wasn't even trying. He honestly thought he was being charming. Nor did it help that he kept trying to set her name to various songs. Last time it was Betty My Love, now it was The Name Game, of all things. She hated that damn song. "He's busy," she said more curtly than she would normally have. As if he'd always intended to do so, Brock skidded to a halt in front of her desk and said suavely, "Oh, I'm here to talk to you, beautiful." Points for effort, she'd give him that much. Nothing fazed the guy. Her nostrils flared, and she frowned. "What's that smell?" "It's a little something called nice and easy." He made as if to sniff the air around her. "What's on you?" "It's called Go Away," she replied, although not without a small smile. Brock was undeterred. "Where'll we go?" "China?" He made a clicking sound with his tongue that was intended to be suggestive. Before Betty could tell him where to go, the thoroughly expected bellowing emerged from behind Jameson's door. The door was thrown open, and a terrified Hoffman scampered backward out of the office. He almost tripped, but Brock caught him. Betty was about to remind Hoffman that he was no longer carrying the easel that he brought into the office when Jameson appeared in the doorway, mustache bristling. He tossed Hoffman's easel after his fleeing form while shouting, "That is the dumbest idea you've ever had, and you've had some doozies!" "Blood pressure," Betty called out, trying to get her voice over Jonah's outraged roaring. Ignoring her, which was certainly nothing new, Jameson turned on his heel and headed back into his office. Seizing the opportunity, Brock headed toward the open door. "Hey!" Betty shouted, half out of her chair. "Where are you going? I said he's busy." She moved so quickly that she banged her knee on the underside of the desk and grabbed it as pain shot through her leg. Just to make things even better, the phone rang. With a moan, she sank back into her chair, picked it up, and said, "J. Jonah Jameson's office," through gritted teeth. The hell with it. If Brock wants to be face-to-face with Jameson that badly, let him. I hope he gets what he deserves. Brock, buoyed by boundless determination, strode into Jameson's office armed with his portfolio. displaying the confidence of a lion tamer facing down the big cats with nothing but a chair and a whip. In this case, the big cats were Jameson and city editor Robbie Robertson, who already seemed deep in conversation when Brock walked in. Jameson's head thrust forward in a manner not unlike a cobra's, and he glared at Eddie. "Who are you?" he demanded. In a low voice, Robbie said, "You hired him last week. Freelance." "I did?" Jameson sniffed the air. "What's that smell?" "It's Brock, sir." "Stupid name for an aftershave." "That's my name." "They named you for an aftershave?" asked Jameson, now hopelessly confused. Brock took a step back, both mentally and physically, and said, "I'm Edward Brock, Jr." "Who?" Since the introduction seemed to be a lost cause, Brock pulled a photograph out of the portfolio and slid it across the desk. Looking for someone to steer the conversation, if one could call it that, away from his name, Brock looked at Jameson and said, "Wow, can I just say I really like that shirt? Here." He pointed to the photograph. "Crane accident. Check out the light source." Jameson slid the photo over to Robbie and glanced at his sleeves. "He likes my shirt," he said with a touch of wonderment, as if no one had ever complimented his wardrobe, which Brock had to admit was probably the case. Robbie barely had to look at it to recognize the quality of it. "We can use it," he said firmly. "How much do you want for it?" demanded Jameson, all business. "Whatever you think is fair, sir." "What? Fair?" Jameson glowered, clearly suspicious that this was a trick response, or perhaps the opening salvo of a lengthy negotiation. "What's your name again?" "Brock, sir," sighed Eddie. "Edward Brock, Jr." He enunciated it slowly, hoping that it would imprint on Jameson's gray matter this time. In the brief silence that followed, as Jameson studied the picture, and obviously calculated an amount that he believed the picture was worth, and that would no doubt have, Brock heard a brief exchange on the other side of the office door. A voice said, "Hi, Betty," followed by Betty quietly replying, "Hi, Pete. You better get in there. New guy." "Great. I show up and get he's busy, you can't go in. This other guy shows up and he's told to hurry right in. Nice to see that our Miss Brant plays favorites. Gotta remember that." The door flew open, and a young and tense-looking guy entered. He was holding a manila envelope in his hand. "Parker, you're late," snapped Jameson, and Brock immediately realized that this was Peter Parker, his main competition. Brock smiled widely, knowing that Parker had already lost this round before he'd even entered the game. "Maybe too late," continued Jameson, confirming Brock's suspicion. "Bruckner here brought me a pretty good photo." Eddie rolled his eyes and was about to correct Jameson as to his name for what seemed the 10th time when Peter extracted a picture from the envelope and said, "I got you this." Peering at the photo, Brock couldn't believe it. An aerial shot of Spider-Man spinning the web that protected the crowd? "How'd you get that shot?" he demanded. "I didn't see you there. How'd you get that high?" "I climbed. Nearly fell off the flagpole." Flagpole? Brock had an excellent memory for scenes. His cameraman's eye gave him a photographic memory. He didn't remember a flagpole there. Was it possible he missed it? He didn't think so, but how else? "Which picture do we use?" asked Robertson. Brock tensed. His was the better composed, with that intense human drama of Spider-Man saving the girl, but Parker's had a broader sweep. Jameson, however, didn't hesitate. "I like Bernstein's." Brock exhaled in relief. Who gave a damn whether Jameson could remember his name, so long as it was correct in the photo credit and on the check? Robertson, holding both photos, nodded once in confirming Jameson's decision. "It's better," he acknowledged, and Brock was sure that he was looking sympathetically at Peter. So Robertson also played favorites. Well, that was going to have to change. "Cheaper too," Jameson announced. "Congratulations, Brooks." "Brock, you idiot. Brock!" Eddie thought. "We're going with your photo, $50. Eddie nearly choked. That wasn't even enough to cover expenses. He'd underestimated Jameson. $50 was maybe a quarter of what the photo was worth. He considered telling Jameson to shove it, but Parker's presence took that option off the table. The competition was in the room, and Eddie wasn't about to torpedo his long-term chances for the short-term satisfaction of telling off J. Jonah Jameson. Instead, he swallowed his irritation and gave a genuine fake smile. "All right, JJ, then I'm your man." He leaned over the desk to extend a handshake to Jameson. Jameson stared at the hand as if wondering why Brock was pointing this thing in his direction. Brock quickly turned the open hand into a fist, as if he'd always meant to, and thumped it firmly on the desktop for emphasis. "I know more about what makes a good picture than any photographer in this town. You see, photography, it's not about, no offense," he nodded to Peter, "flagpoles, whatever. It's about lighting, composition, drama." Eddie saw that Jameson was nodding, looking interested. Although Eddie was taking a huge risk, he decided that now was the time to get aggressive. "I want a staff job, sir. I have a girl that I intend to marry, and I have this kind of stupid little dream of working for one of the greatest newspaper editors of our time, J. Jonah Jameson." Jameson was soaking it up like a sponge. "Well, we do have an opening. Johnson quit, remember?" he said to Robertson. "You fired him," Robertson reminded him. "Whatever." Peter Parker, however, was clearly not about to roll over. "Well, wait a minute," he protested. "I know what makes a good picture, and I've been here a long time. If there's a staff job, Mr. Jameson, I think I deserve it." Robertson, that great player of favorites, said, "He's right, Jonah. Peter's been with us for years. He's done a great job." Looking from one to the other, Jameson growled, "You want a staff job and you want a staff job. Anyone care about what I want?" Hoffman, displaying the resilience of a whack-a-mole, stuck his head in and said, "I do." "Shut up. Get out." Jameson snapped, and Hoffman immediately did so. Jameson turned his attention back to the new photographers. He shoved an unlit cigar in his mouth and rolled it from one side to the other a few times. "I want the public to see Spider-Man for the two-bit criminal he really is," he finally said. "He's a fake. He's full of stickum. Catch him in the act. Spider-Man with his hand in a cookie jar." He paused for dramatic effect, then concluded, "Whoever brings me that photo gets the job." When neither Brock nor Parker initially moved, Jameson snapped, "What are you waiting for? Chinese New Year? Go, go, go!" "I'm on it, boss," Brock announced and headed for the door. As Eddie went, Peter Parker was one step behind him, which was just how Brock liked it. But he was surprised when Parker said in an unusually intense voice, "You'll never get that picture." "Oh, we'll see." Brock fired a smug grin at Parker as if it were a done deal, eyes blazing with determination. "We'll see." 9. Uneasy Homecomings. Peter Parker walked through Times Square, frustrated by the situation in which he now found himself. There was only one way that he could give J. Jonah Jameson what he wanted: by setting up some sort of false picture and criminalizing his alter ego. He couldn't see himself doing it. No way. Peter was skirting the line of ethics as it was, taking photographs of himself in action and selling those to the Daily Bugle. He always told himself that it wasn't really fraud. He wasn't setting up the situations that Spider-Man got himself into. He was simply providing photographic documentation of events. He didn't see it as being morally any different from, say, writing an autobiography and being paid for it. But faking a photo of Spider-Man doing something corrupt? That crossed the line. No job was worth it. Besides, if he did transform Spider-Man into a criminal by making it look as if Spider-Man had done something illegal, wouldn't that impede his other identity's effectiveness? Things were turning the corner in public perception. Why roll matters back to suspicion and apprehension? Bottom line, the citizens of New York had no reason to fear Spider-Man. Giving them one would be criminal in and of itself. If Peter required any further proof of that, it came as he stopped and looked up at the news scrolling across the Jumbotron screen high above. There was footage of Spider-Man swinging away from the site of the crane incident, with people waving excitedly at his departure, and the words, "Spider-Man to receive key to the city." This was wishful thinking on the part of city administrators. No one had contacted him about such a thing since Naturally, they had no means of doing so. Instead, he'd heard and read about the intended ceremony in the local news. The mayor said that they were going to make this presentation, and their hope was that Spider-Man would see fit to join them. If he didn't, the key would be donated to the Museum of New York and be put on permanent display. Peter hadn't bothered to call and say he'd come. The chances were that every crank in the city was doing exactly that already, no doubt hoping some sort of monetary reward came with the honor. In fact, he'd more or less decided that he would not show up. As Peter Parker, he was seeking ways to bring in regular income. But being Spider-Man wasn't about chasing wealth and fame. Still, with Jameson's latest mad-on about Spider-Man and being so anxious to prove the web-slinger a menace, Peter couldn't resist the thought of Spider-Man being lionized by the very public to which Jameson wanted to criminalize him. Peter continued to go back and forth about it as he headed over toward the hospital where Harry Osborn was preparing to check out. By the time he arrived, he hadn't yet made a decision. He gave it no further thought as he went to Harry's room and found his friend dressed and ready to go. Harry still looked a little unsteady, even weak, but the hospital had pronounced him fit to travel and decreed that bed rest in his own home was the best thing for him. Hospital policy insisted that Harry be brought to the hospital doors in a wheelchair, and Peter was only too happy to oblige. "Good thing I survived, huh, Pete?" said Harry with an amused snort. Otherwise, he wouldn't have Harry Osborn to push around anymore. Peter laughed at that. It felt good to be relaxing with his old friend. The more time that passed, the more Harry acted like his old self. The more it convinced Peter that maybe the worst really was past them. Harry's limo driver was waiting for them, and the ride over to the townhouse was amazingly carefree. They reminisced about their time in high school and how Peter had bailed Harry out when it came to science. When talk turned, as it invariably did, toward Norman Osborn, Harry was fairly restrained. Peter supposed that was natural. The poor guy was trying to cope with so many losses at once. Once they arrived, Peter helped Harry through the main foyer and into the small elevator that would carry them to the penthouse floor. Harry inserted the key that would bring them up there, and the elevator shuddered slightly before it wheezed to life and hauled them to the top floor. Bernard, Harry's butler, was waiting for them, and he opened the ornate gate that blocked access to the penthouse itself. Harry and Peter stepped off the elevator, Peter hovering near Harry's elbow just in case his friend was seized with momentary weakness. "Welcome home, Harry," Bernard said as he stepped aside. "Thank God you're all right." Harry nodded slightly in acknowledgement, while Bernard relieved Harry of his small suitcase. "Thank you, Bernard." The penthouse was split level, and Bernard headed upstairs, where he would unpack Harry's suitcase for him. Peter shrugged off his backpack and removed from it a large, round, crudely gift-wrapped object. Harry didn't notice it at first, since he was gazing around the penthouse as if seeing it for the first time. Peter figured that, in a way, he was. Harry had lived here all his life, but it had always been his father's house, and Harry was just in residence. Now Harry needed to reacquaint himself with the fact that it was his home, not Norman's. That alone was going to require some adjustment. "Brought you a homecoming gift," Peter said, hoping to take Harry's thoughts away from that morbid direction. Harry took it from him and opened it, but the smile on his face indicated that he knew what it was before he even unwrapped it. "It's your old ball," he said, and sure enough, it was. A battered, slightly underinflated basketball with the name Parker scrawled on it. "Thanks, buddy." He dribbled it a few times, then tossed it to Peter at a reasonably good pass. "We were pretty good in the backyard." "Come on, we were terrible," Peter good-naturedly reminded him and threw the ball back. "Whatever made us try out for the varsity team?" "Cheerleaders." Peter nodded, recalling. "They were cute." Looking thoughtful, Harry asked, "Do I have any girlfriends?" "I don't know." "You don't?" Harry raised his voice and called out, Bernard, do I have any girlfriends? Not that I know of, sir, Bernard's crisp tone replied from upstairs. Harry passed the ball back to Peter. They moved through the giant front hallway, ricocheting the ball back and forth between them, dribbling and acting as if they were on a basketball court. The steady, bouncing sound of the basketball echoed through the vast hall. Hey, this is a cool pad, Harry decided, clearly liking the idea that he could play basketball indoors without fear of remonstration. Sure beats my place. And Harry bounded the ball to Peter once more. Looks like I'm not hurting for money, right? Harry, you're loaded, Peter said with a laugh. Harry considered this and then grinned. I think I can turn this no-girlfriend thing around. Their impromptu basketball game carried them into the main salon, and Harry froze. Peter followed his gaze to see what Harry was staring at, and shouldn't have been surprised. There, hanging on the wall, was a large, formal portrait painting of Norman Osborn. The eyes appeared to be fixed on Harry. Peter wondered if Norman's gaze followed you around no matter where you stood in the room. Harry stared back, as if expecting the real Norman to peel himself off the painting. I always appreciated how you got me through high school, he said, his voice subdued, as if they were at a museum or a wake. I wish I could remember more about him. No, you don't, Peter thought. Flipping the ball from one hand to the other, Peter said uncomfortably, Well, he loved you. That's the main thing. He bounced the ball back toward Harry then, hoping to distract him. He failed utterly as the ball bounced past Harry and smacked into a pedestal supporting an antique vase that looked to be from the Ming Dynasty. Peter was horrified as he saw the pedestal tilt from the impact and the vase begin to fall. He was too far away to do anything about it short of leaping all the way across the room, or else firing some web lines to intercept it. Harry, however, moved quickly, far more quickly than he should have been able to. Instantly, he grabbed the ball to prevent it from bouncing around and hitting other breakables, while, at the same time, snagging the falling vase out of midair with the other hand. Amazed at his prowess, Harry stared at both the ball and the vase, and then at Peter. Wow! Did you see that? Oh, yes, Peter had most definitely had, and was extremely uneasy over having done so. The last thing he needed was Harry wondering why he could move faster, and with greater strength than ever before. Quickly, Peter did the best he could to hide his growing anxiety, as he said cheerfully, Guess he still got the moves. Guess so. Carefully, Harry placed the vase on the pedestal, then flipped the ball back to Peter. Varsity, here we come. A little late for varsity. How about the NBA? Damn straight. And if I can't get in on tryouts, I'll just buy a team and put myself on the starting rotation. If that doesn't get the girls, nothing will. Peter agreed, allowing relief to flood through him. The two friends continued passing the ball back and forth as they headed out of the room. Curiously, when Peter passed a full-length mirror, he felt a twinge of warning from his spider sense. He had no idea why. Perhaps it was because he saw the portrait of Norman Osborn reflected in it. That had to be it. The thing would be enough to give anyone the creeps. Mary Jane Watson had come to think of the Broadhurst Theater as her home away from home. Considering the amount of time MJ spent there, she should have been paying rent, and the cast, the wonderful cast, had become her extended family. That business with Peter earlier today had been difficult. She'd finally forced herself to realize that maybe Peter couldn't understand simply because he wasn't an actor. Acting was a profession like none other, and seeking solace from Peter might well have been the wrong move because it was beyond his ability to comprehend. As she had told him, when he went out into the public eye, at least he had anonymity. For Mary Jane, stepping out on the stage and singing was the equivalent of stripping naked, standing in a store display window, and inviting passerby to take their best shot. She could explain that to Peter, and he could comprehend it intellectually. But he couldn't really sympathize the way that her castmates would. Looking forward to much understanding and empathy from her extended family, Mary Jane walked into the theater foyer, in the hopes that the day was going to take a much better turn. She was understandably confused then when she saw another actress standing center stage singing Falling in Love. At first, MJ thought it was her understudy getting some rehearsal in, but then the rest of the cast came in on cue, moving to their marks. Both the producer and the director were seated in the center of the theater, and the director was clapping his hands briskly together as a way of bringing everything to a halt. The cast obediently stopped, as did the music. Stop on the 5th step, Helen, then hold it for a beat, then hit it. Next to him, the producer nodded in agreement. Helen nodded, and the music, provided for rehearsal by a pianist, started up again. Helen opened her mouth to start singing, but then stopped as she spotted Mary Jane standing in the back of the theater. The director and producers turned to see where Helen was looking, and the director looked visibly startled when he saw Mary Jane there. So did the rest of the cast. "What's she doing here?" he whispered to the producer, his voice carrying despite the low tones. "Didn't anybody call her?" The cast was huddled together now, as if expecting a storm to come rolling in. Mary Jane moved to the top of the aisle and simply gaped, like an orphan watching a Thanksgiving feast through a window while snow fell upon her. There were her dear friends, Linda Curtis, Solomon Abrams, the rest of them, all staring back as if she had no right to be there. "You can't go home again." Clearly feeling he had to take charge of the situation, the director walked toward her, an apologetic look on his face. "We tried to reach you," he began. The reality of what Mary Jane was seeing finally began to sink in. "They're cutting me. Cutting me because of one critic." "One critic?" she said aloud. The producer had now come up and said, "All the papers, dear." Realizing how harsh that sounded, and having no desire to make Mary Jane feel worse than she did, he added sympathetically, "If you'd like, we can say you became ill." That wasn't going to be simply a cover story. It was everything Mary Jane could do not to vomit right there in the middle of the theater. She wondered if her legs were visibly trembling, because it sure felt as if they were. "Sit down, Mary Jane," the director urged her. "Let us explain." She didn't want his explanations. She wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. Without a word, Mary Jane turned and walked out. No, not walked. Ran. She didn't want to exit to house left. That would take her out past the box office, and she had no desire to see people in line to purchase tickets. Instead, she headed in the other direction, through the side exit that opened out onto a narrow alleyway. The door slammed heavily behind her, like a guillotine blade, severing her ties to the group of strangers whom she had briefly considered family. Clutching her small overnight bag tightly under her arm, she headed down the alley and stepped out onto 44th Street. Instantly, there was a chorus of cheers, applause, whistling. Was the reception for her? Perhaps the producer had been spooked by the crummy reviews, but at least the fans had their backs to her. They were looking in another direction entirely. They were looking up. Mary Jane did the same, although she didn't really have to. She knew what everyone was going nuts over. Spider-Man. There he went, webbing his way across the skyline. In the distance, she could hear sirens wailing. He was off on another mission of mercy, and everyone adored him for it. Mary Jane never wanted to hate someone more than she did at that moment, and had never been more incapable of doing so. Filled with frustration and self-loathing, and determined not to let anyone see her cry, Mary Jane headed back to the place that she called her apartment, but was still not home. "Home is other people," she said aloud. And some guy passing her, probably a writer from the aesthetic look of him, promptly corrected her by saying, Hell is other people. Jean-Paul Sartre." I guess he'd know. He stared at her a moment, Do I know you from someplace? No, Mary Jane said quietly. No one knows me at all. Without another word, she headed away from the Broadhurst as quickly as she could. 10. Grandstanding. Peter Parker was certain that he had never seen a more gorgeous day than the one facing him this crisp morning. Absolutely no clouds, sky a perfect blue. He had spent time with Harry the day before, and everything seemed okay with him. Granted, he hadn't been able to get in touch with Mary Jane, but when one considered everything that they had been through and had survived, both in their relationship and in their lives, certainly they'd be able to get through this. For God's sake, it was a single review from some loud-mouthed critic. She'd get past it. With the perspective of distance, she'd realize that she was making too much of it. Everything was going to be all right. Because this was his day, baby. His day. He was down by City Hall, moving past the displays of banners and balloons that had been created to celebrate the greatness that was, let's face it, him. Police lines had been set up for crowd control of the vast number of people assembling for the celebration. It was a heady experience. Peter was completely blown away by the positive energy and outpouring of support. He couldn't believe he'd seriously considered skipping the entire event. Every single person there was wondering the same thing. Was Spider-Man going to show up? Peter Parker was the only one who knew the answer to that, and he was loving every minute of it. In the old days, he would be frustrated as the public and media trash-talked Spider-Man, and he'd feel so tempted to rip the mask off and shout, "Hey, look, see? I'm just an ordinary guy under here, not the monster everyone's making me out to be. So cut me a break, would you please?" Those were the times that he despised the need to keep his identity a secret. Now, though, he was getting a kick out of being the only one here who knew what Spider-Man's plans were. A discordant blatting of musical notes cut through his thoughts. A high school marching band was tuning up, and there had to be something like 1,000 people of varying ages and sizes attired in homemade Spider-Man outfits. Peter brought out his camera and started clicking away. He didn't care whether Jonah bought him or not. If nothing else, he could create a scrapbook, so he'd always have a visual record of the greatest day of his life. A small boy in a Spider-Man costume, noticing that Peter was taking pictures, ran toward him with some sort of large plastic device on his wrist. A lever attached to a canister. Oh shit, I remember that. There's still silly string on the garage from when we were messing with that. That was years ago. Shit, blast from the past. The kid pulled the lever, and a small gout of what appeared to be silly string spurted out from it. Peter recognized it for what it was, a homemade web shooter. Peter tried to contemplate what it would be like building a functioning mechanical web shooter if he didn't possess organic spinnerets. He couldn't even begin to imagine how he would make such a thing. The kid tried to fire more webbing, but the can made a fizzling noise. Obviously, he was out of ammo. Peter glanced right and left, saw that no one was paying attention, extended his right arm, and fired a quick burst of his own webbing. It leapt out from his forearm and splattered on the kid's shoe, creating a small patch of web on it. The boy's eyes went wide as he correctly figured out what had just happened, and he turned and shouted, "Mama, I just saw Spider-Man!" By the time his mother came to the kid's side and looked where he was pointing, Peter had already joined a group of teenage Spider-Man fans and easily mingled in. The boy's mother would just assume her son was referring to a particularly effective costume. In the large plaza area directly in front of City Hall, Peter spotted Gwen Stacy standing near the proscenium, studying a piece of paper as if it had been produced by divine hand. The way she kept closing her eyes and murmuring to herself, Peter surmised that she was attempting to memorize the contents. In her other hand, she was holding a large golden object, the fabled key to the city. Gwen looked in his direction, except she wasn't looking at him. She was just randomly turning his way as she continued moving her lips in memorization. Then she focused on him and realized he was standing there, waving. Her face brightened. "Hiya, Pete." "Nice key." he said. She nodded, looking distracted as she did so, and held up the piece of paper she'd been studying. Trying to put the right words together. How do I introduce somebody who saved my life? Keep it simple. Maybe just, here he is, folks, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He glanced around, saw various important-looking individuals coming together at the base of the proscenium. Things were about to start rolling. Any lingering doubts that he had about making a personal appearance were finally put to rest by the hopeful look in Gwen's eyes. It would mean so much to her to be able to tell Spider-Man how she felt. And, okay, admit it. Admit your darker feelings to yourself at least. The way that Mary Jane was looking at you so accusingly, so full of hurt the other day. You were trying your best. Honest to God, you were, but it wasn't enough. And there are some days where you just get fed up with the notion that your best doesn't measure up. So here's Gwen Stacy, and all she has to do is mention Spider-Man and her eyes just light up with gratitude and excitement. And don't you frankly deserve some of this? After all these years, finally being appreciated for everything you have to offer? Aren't you finally getting your due? And what the hell is wrong with being pleased about it and feeling entitled to... He shook himself out of his reverie and added, then list some of his great achievements, before heading off into the crowd. Gwen watched Peter go and smiled. What a nice guy he was. No Spider-Man, of course, but not everyone could be. Hell, hardly anyone could be. She headed toward the stairs that led up to the stage, and suddenly a voice from behind her shouted, "Boo!" A startled Gwen jumped as she spun to face the speaker, only to find herself staring down the lens of a camera. A series of rapid clicks told her that her slightly frightened expression had been preserved for posterity, and she wasn't the least bit happy about it. And unsurprisingly, the photographer made no effort to capture the scowl that quickly followed. Tossing her long blonde hair out of her face, she snapped, "Eddie, I don't have time. I'm working on my speech." Eddie Brock lowered his camera and asked, "Need any help?" "Not now." She headed for the stage. Eddie followed, not taking the hint. "I'll see you tonight, right?" "Not tonight." "Why not?" he persisted. "We had a great time." "We had coffee, Eddie." "But you let me kiss you goodnight." Gwen, becoming totally fed up with his conversation, turned and faced Eddie, with one foot on the steps that led up to the stage. "It was just a little kiss, Eddie. It was nice. Excuse me." As Gwen headed up the steps, she wondered about the kind of luck she'd been having lately. It certainly was running to extremes. On the one hand, she'd encountered Eddie Brock in a casual meeting at a Starbucks near ESU. They had had a pleasant enough conversation, happened upon each other yet again at the same Starbucks, except now she was wondering whether it wasn't happenstance and Eddie had simply been staking out the place after their first encounter. Spent some more time together, and he'd brought her home that night. She shouldn't have kissed him. Gwen was all too often a creature of impulse. But he'd seemed nice, and even a little needy, and so it had happened just before she'd walked into her house. It was nothing much to her, and frankly, he tasted a lot like coffee. Apparently, though, it had meant way, way too much to Eddie, and now his actions were bordering on obsessive. How could one compare her stupidity in kissing him with his stupidity in stalking the daughter of a cop? Contrast that experience to nearly plunging to her death, only to be miraculously rescued by a masked man on a string of web. She wondered why in the world she couldn't meet a nice, decent, down-to-earth kind of guy. Someone comfortably between the two extremes. At which point, Peter Parker's face suddenly came to her mind. She turned and looked back toward the crowd, thinking that maybe she should have invited him up onto the stage with her. If Eddie saw Gwen next to another young guy, it might send him a message. Besides, Peter was smart, reasonably good-looking, and wonderfully normal with his feet solidly on the ground. Maybe the answer was right there in front of her, and she just had to see it. Unfortunately, Peter was nowhere to be seen. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Mary Jane wondered for what seemed the umpteenth time as she moved through the crowd, and for the umpteenth time she had no sure answer. She had spent the rest of the previous day and much of the night staring at the telephone, trying to decide whether to call Peter. Her phone rang a couple of times, but she shut off the volume on her answering machine so that she didn't have to listen to the message being left. She didn't want to talk to anyone unless it was on her own initiative. After a sleepless night, she had finally picked up the phone and dialed him, only to discover he wasn't there. Then, turning on the TV, she'd seen live news coverage of this Spider-Man love-in. Of course. So she had come here, not knowing why, but feeling the need to be with Peter, to see him, to tell him that she'd been fired? That his perceptions of her abilities had been clouded by his love for her, and because of that she couldn't count on him to give an unvarnished assessment of her talent? And was that really such a bad thing? "Hey, beautiful, can I take your picture?" Mary Jane glanced over her shoulder, and sure enough, there he was, focusing on her. If he'd only shown up a few minutes later, she might have gotten her thoughts in order. As it was, the best she could manage was a half-hearted smile. Peter lowered the camera, picture still not taken, then approached her and stopped half a foot away, as if she had a force field around her. "Hope you're not still mad at me," he said. "No, Peter, I'm proud of you." He smiled then, pointing the camera, and took a picture. Then he stepped in closely and said in a low voice, "I'm planning to swing in from over there." He pointed behind her. Mary Jane, in the meantime, glanced down at the camera's tiny display screen. The digital picture that he'd just taken was still on it. There she was, all right. But behind her was a banner reading "Spidey the Mighty." She wasn't sure, but it looked as if her image was slightly blurry while the banner was perfectly clear, as if he had to decide which to focus on, and had opted for the sign. Then the picture blinked out and went back to view mode. Maybe she was overthinking it, or at least she hoped she was. "Give him a good show," she urged him. A marching band played an opening fanfare, complete with drum roll, and Mary Jane sensed the anticipation rising in the crowd. Peter was already fiddling with the top button on his shirt, and as he started to move away, he called to her, "Hey, I made a reservation for dinner tomorrow. I left you a message." Hearing that, Mary Jane knew she had to confess everything. Heaven forbid Peter would go to meet her at the theater and find her name missing from the marquee and the posters, as if it had never been there. But she couldn't bring herself to tell him now, not when he was in such a fantastically upbeat mood. Sensing her conflict and unhappiness, not knowing why, Peter obviously concluded that she was still upset about her bad press, which technically she was, but not for the reasons he had assumed. "And don't worry about that review," he urged her as a parting shot. "We'll be laughing about it tomorrow." He moved off toward a building across the street. No one noticed, since all eyes were focused on the stage some distance off. "Yeah," was all she could bring herself to say. With Peter gone, she felt like a balloon with the air out of it. She tried to pay attention to the festivities. The band had segued straight from New York, New York to a marching version of the Itsy Bitsy Spider, a tune she'd never have thought lent itself to a brass band. Mary Jane was suddenly overwhelmed by everything she was seeing. Everyone was so happy, and she was so miserable. She had no place here, as if she might drag down the mood of the entire crowd with her sorrow. Deciding she couldn't stand to be there anymore, Mary Jane turned to leave and found herself face to face with an equally startled Harry Osborn. He had a small bandage on his head and a slight but fading discoloration under his eye, the only souvenirs of his hospital stay. "Hey, MJ," he said with an enthusiasm so contagious that she couldn't help but smile in return, the first genuine smile she'd made in what seemed like ages. "Harry, where's Pete?" he asked, glancing around. Naturally, it made sense that he would assume Peter would be here. Even with his memory on the fritz, he was aware that a news event with Spider-Man present would be the ideal function for his photographer buddy to attend. "Taking somebody's picture, I guess," she said, trying to sound casual, and worried that instead she came across as forced. It didn't appear to register on Harry, who just seemed so grateful to be alive that Mary Jane was basking in his positive aura. "I'm so happy to see you. You look so good, Harry." "I never felt better," he replied, chipper. "Very strange feeling, not knowing exactly who you are. Bump on the head and I'm as free as a bird." Except it was obvious to Mary Jane that Harry knew who he was. He was simply bereft of the sadness that had shrouded him the past months. Harry had a clean emotional slate, and she envied him for that. "Will you bump me on the head?" Playfully, he tapped her lightly on the forehead with his knuckles. Then he looked around, taking in the celebratory atmosphere, and that, combined with the music being played, appeared to trigger a recollection. "Hey, Peter said you were in a play. You were there, remember? You sent me flowers." "I did?" He looked momentarily confused, then shrugged it off, his newly cheerful nature simply unable to sustain anything other than feeling upbeat. "I'll come tonight." "You can't," she said quickly. She saw the surprised look on his face. Clearly he thought that she didn't want him at the show for some reason, and she was stuck. Mary Jane lowered her voice and said, "I was let go." "What happened?" "I wasn't very good." She tried to make it sound lighthearted, but the misery in her voice was palpable. "Don't say that. Man," he said, frustrated. "I wish I could remember so you'd believe me when I said you must have been good and they're all nuts. But I know I've seen you in other stuff and I know what you can do. You are really good." "I don't know," she sighed. She was slightly buoyed by his confidence in her, but still shaken by all that had happened. "Sometimes I think I am, but then I'm not sure." The crowd around them had started chanting, "Spider-Man! Spider-Man!" It made it almost impossible for them to continue the conversation. Harry stepped closer to Mary Jane and practically shouted in her ear, "You know, this is embarrassing, but I once wrote a play for you in high school." "You wrote me a play?" Mary Jane couldn't have been more surprised if Harry had sprouted a third eye on his forehead. Even when they'd been dating, he'd never struck her as the creative type. Obviously, he felt so self-conscious about his work that he couldn't even bring himself to show it to anyone. "I forget how it went," he said with a shrug. "It was some silly romantic thing." "Harry," she touched the side of his face affectionately, "that's the sweetest thing." "Well, you know I'd still put you in my play." It was comments like that, the surprising moments of tenderness that Harry Osborn was capable of displaying, that reminded her of why she'd gone out with him. Granted, it had all soured because of Harry's father, but Norman Osborn was gone, and that part of Harry that had acted so badly toward MJ was also gone. Well, wasn't this an interesting development? A female voice boomed over the sound system. After a brief squeal of feedback that was quickly adjusted for, the attractive blonde on the podium said, "I'm here today because I fell 62 stories and someone caught me. Someone who never asks for anything in return. Someone who doesn't even want us to know who he is." The girl, whom Mary Jane knew was Gwen Stacy, since she'd certainly had her name and picture plastered in enough places since her near-death experience, continued. "So I ask you, when you're dropping without a parachute, or your store's being robbed, or your house is on fire, who is it that breaks your fall and puts out the flames and saves your children?" Peter Parker, thought Mary Jane. Peter Parker, who always had time to be the guy you're here to worship, and never time for me. And I'm such a creep for being upset about that. "Spider-Man!" bellowed the crowd. Atop a nearby building, Peter Parker, clad in his red and blue costume, listened for Gwen Stacy's introduction and decided that it was a hell of a lot better than the quick "here he is" that he'd suggested. The crowd shouted Spider-Man's name, and he murmured to himself in amazement, "They love me." "And who," Gwen was saying, "with astounding courage puts his life on the line every day for justice and fairness." "Spider-Man!" they screamed yet again. "Then let's hear it," said Gwen, expertly playing to the crowd. "For the one, for the only, for the fabulous, the sexy Spider-Man!" The music swelled. The crowd roared. Had there been a roof, the energy level would have been through it. And all that from people who still didn't know if Spider-Man was actually going to show up. It was a celebration of more than just the hero. It was all about the city's appreciation for him. Well then, how could he possibly let down his adoring public? Firing a web line, Peter swung out high over the crowd. It took only seconds for people to spot him, and if the cheers had sounded loud before, they were now positively thunderous, spectators just out of their minds with glee. He drank it in hungrily, greedily, like a man dying of thirst coming upon not simply an oasis, but an Irish pub. He was giddy with the adoration. It was intoxicating. And like a man who was genuinely drunk, he went further than he should have. Gwen Stacy clapped her hands in delight as she saw Spider-Man hurtling down toward her. She had prepared an entire second half of the speech in the event of his being a no-show. Although she hadn't been looking forward to it. She knew what the crowd wanted, and it wasn't a longer speech. They wanted their hero, in person, live, large, and in charge. Now they were getting their wish. Spider-Man swung high above, twirling his body as he soared in an upward arc. It was pure showing off. Not that it mattered in the least. The crowd was eating up every moment. Someone had written a catchy little song about Spider-Man that had been in heavy rotation on the local radio stations. The marching band struck it up, and Spider-Man now dropped down at dizzying speed. There were gasps, some of shock and fear that he was going to hit the ground like a rock, and some in excitement as they anticipated his pulling out of it just in time. The second contingent was naturally correct, as he fired a web line behind him that snagged the top of the City Hall archway. Spider-Man lowered himself so that he was upside down and facing Gwen. Face to face, Gwen put her arms around him and posed for the battery of cameras that flashed away. Under his mask, Peter was grinning like a lunatic. Suddenly, to the sound of wolf whistles and cries of "kiss him," Gwen gave him a kiss on his masked cheek. With his ego swelled almost to bursting by the unparalleled adulation of the crowd, Peter proceeded to seize the moment full on. "Go ahead, lay one on me," Peter told her. Gwen looked startled, but not in a bad way. "Really? I'll love it." She leaned in toward him and pulled down his mask so that it cleared his mouth. Then she kissed him with a startling ferocity that Peter wouldn't have expected from the normally sedate Gwen Stacy. For an instant, it took him out of the moment, and he remembered that improbable, deliriously romantic kiss he'd shared with Mary Jane while rain poured down upon them in buckets. That kiss seemed long ago and far away. And this was very much happening in the here and now. All he was thinking about were the shouts and cheers, and that his head was probably going to explode any moment. The thoughts of that rain-soaked kiss also caused him to dwell on Mary Jane, but he wasn't concerned. She was a working actress. He'd watched her kiss other guys on stage, and it hadn't bothered him because he knew that she was performing a character. That's all he was doing as well. Certainly Mary Jane could understand all that, right? Mary Jane watched with her eyes wide, filling with disbelief, hurt, anger. What the hell was Peter playing at? Was this some sort of sick game to try to make her feel jealous? As if she hadn't been feeling low enough, inadequate enough. Now this? Now this? Harry, like everyone else around him, was focused on what was happening on stage. "Wow, hope Pete's getting a shot of this," he said. "Not like the shot I'm going to want to give him." The The band had switched to a punchy college fight song version of that infernal Spider-Man tune, as if their hero had just scored a touchdown. Mary Jane, unable to take it anymore, felt tears stinging her eyes. She turned away and wiped the moisture from her face, praying that it wouldn't cause her makeup to run. She couldn't imagine this day getting worse. She was about to discover just how limited her imagination was. Gwen was only partly playing to the crowd as she affected a swoon. She stepped away from Spider-Man, swaying a bit, and grasped the standing microphone as if it were the only thing preventing her from falling over. "Wow," she sighed. A shadow fell over her. At first, Gwen thought that some errant clouds had moved in and blocked out the sun. But no, the sky was clear. Meanwhile, the shadow continued to spread, darkness covering the crowd, Spider-Man, the entire district. People began to scream and point, and then Gwen saw what was causing it. Even when she did, it made no sense. She could imagine something like this in the middle of the Sahara, but not in downtown Manhattan. But there it was, unmistakable. A cloud of sand, hundreds of feet high, barreling towards them, blotting out the sun and hurtling at high speed down the narrow canyons of the city. Spectators started to run, prepared to stampede over whoever was in their way to get clear of it. And then suddenly, impossibly, the sandstorm made a sharp right 3 blocks shy of overwhelming the celebration. Rounding a corner as if it were a combination of sandstorm and tornado, the sand cloud disappeared, although a distant roaring could still be heard. "What was that thing?" Gwen asked, forgetting that she was still at the microphone and her question was going out to the entire crowd. Spider-Man's determined declaration of, "I don't know, but I'm going to find out," resulted in another roar of support from the crowd. He bounded upward, fired a web line, and swung off after what would more than likely turn out to be some sort of weird atmospheric condition. Yet the science student in Gwen told her that it couldn't possibly be that simple. Her inner science student, as it turns out, was absolutely right. 11. Son of a Beach. Flint Marko was brimming with confidence. It was a pleasant feeling, one that he was unaccustomed to, given the usual assortment of people criticizing him, beating him down, or at least trying to. Now, as he strode down the streets of New York City, he looked back on all the people who had made his life miserable, people who had loomed so large in his day-to-day existence. Cops, wardens, his wife, teachers, his parents, especially his father. Indeed, the crappy way his father had treated him had compelled him to be the best parent he humanly could for Penny's sake. It was odd. All those loomed so large people now seemed small, pathetic, even irrelevant. How could he have ever been so concerned about them? They were nothing. He was now a giant, bestriding humanity like a colossus. And if they didn't like him, or despised him, or thought he was beneath them, what did it matter? All they could do was shout at him or try to tear him down. And that just wasn't going to be happening anymore. Not to Flint Marko. Because Flint Marko was no longer there. He had left the building, gone on to a better place. The man that he was now, the being that he was now, had as much in common with Flint Marko as Flint Marko had in common with an amoeba. Thinking of himself as merely Flint Marko would be limiting. He scratched his ear thoughtfully, wondering, if he wasn't Flint Marko, who was he? A few grains of sand fell out of his ear. Feeling as if something was still in there, he pounded firmly on the side of his head as he tilted it, and a stream of sand poured out. That wasn't surprising, as he had trimmed away excess sand so that his features would appear more and more normal. The grains had simply retreated into his body. Because of that, he now had too much sand between his ears. Once he'd extracted it, though, he felt a lot better. Some blocks away, he heard music and cheering. He snorted and wondered if it was to celebrate his return to New York City, and somehow doubted this was the case. He walked past 2 policemen who were sitting in a cop car. Marco barely afforded them a glance as he kept on going. He heard one of them say, "Isn't that the guy from the prison break?" And the other replied, "Fits the description." "Hey you! Halt!" Marco didn't feel like bothering with them. They were too little and simply not worth the time. Walking quickly across the street, he ducked behind a construction truck. The police officers, pursuing him on foot, split up and came around the truck from 2 different directions, knowing there was nowhere for him to go. To their confusion, they came from either side and met on the other end of the truck. There was no sign of him. However, a large tarp covered the back of the truck, and the 2 cops looked at each other and nodded together. Clearly, they thought they had him. Seconds later, one of them had whipped the tarp aside and both of them had their guns leveled, fully expecting to see Flint Marco charging them in a hopeless attempt to escape. There was nothing there except a truckload of sand. One of the cops grabbed a shovel and stepped forward, about to push it into the sand. That was when Marco suddenly thought, "Why am I hiding? Why am I waiting for them to go away? Why am I afraid of them? That's the old way of thinking. That's Flint Marco's way of thinking. I'm not Flint Marco anymore. I'm not a man of flesh and blood. I'm a man of sand. Yeah, I'm the Sandman. And the Sandman lies down for no one." Before the cop could start probing, a giant sandstone hand thrust upward, launching him into the air. He soared a short distance and came down hard on a car windshield. A patrol car rolled up and several more cops sprang out. "It's like a clown car," the Sandman grimly thought, and he decided to make clear to them just how hopeless the situation was. He rose, having merged his form with the load of sand that was already in the truck, and towered over them, 20 feet high and growing with every passing second. The cops stepped back, goggle-eyed, and went for their weapons. Instantly, Sandman was filled with concern, but not for himself. Unlike the cops, he knew their bullets would be useless against him. They were in a populated area, and flying bullets didn't discriminate between criminals and law-abiding citizens. He had an image of a little girl, not unlike Penny, standing up at her window somewhere to see what all the noise was about, and getting an errant slug square between the eyes. He opened his mouth to tell the police they should just put the guns down, but no voice came out. He was still working on being able to speak without normal vocal cords, or a tongue when the cops opened fire. Bullets tore through his chest and out his back. He looked down and saw daylight streaming through the holes. "Don't!" he finally managed to say. "I said don't!" You'd think they'd have learned. Instead, they kept shooting. He couldn't believe that he was more worried about citizens being hurt than the cops were. His physical form imitated his thoughts, and he transformed into an angry sandstorm that blasted down the street. Overwhelmed by the force and fury of it, the cops were knocked flat onto their backs, clawing at the air, unable to breathe. Nor were the police cars spared Sandman's wrath, as they were flipped over from the sheer power of his onslaught, their wheels spinning. Seeing no point to continue screwing around with the fools who thought they had a chance in hell against him, Sandman blasted down the narrow canyons of the city. He never knew how much free-floating dirt and dust there was in New York. He gathered it all to himself like a nurturing father, and grew larger and larger, until he was a living sandstorm 60 stories high. People ran screaming from his advance, which was fine by him. He wasn't out to kill anyone. He simply wanted to help his daughter, and having cops wasting ammunition on him wasn't going to accomplish that. Satisfied that he had left his pursuers behind, Sandman reconstituted himself, drawing in the grit tighter and faster, until he looked like a stationary whirlwind. Seconds later, the sand and wind faded, leaving him standing there looking at his hands. They appeared fairly normal, and he smiled with satisfaction. It was taking him less time to sculpt himself to human specifications. Clearly, he was ahead of the learning curve. He smiled as he stood outside his target, an armored car outside the First National Bank. The words Manhattan Safe Armored Car Co. were emblazoned on the side, along with the assurance that the company had been protecting New York since 1925. That was laughable. They didn't give a damn about New York. They cared about protecting New York's money. Not exactly the same thing. As he stood there, the armored car, oblivious of his presence, roared to life and pulled away from the curb. Either they had just discharged the contents so the car was empty and useless, or else they'd just made a pickup, in which case it was ready to be picked like an overripe grape. With a single thought, he caused the grains of his body to separate slightly, making him light as air. He vaulted to the top of the truck and instantly brought them all back together, tighter than they originally were. Far denser than a normal human, Sandman landed with a heavy thud atop the roof, the paneling creaking and groaning beneath his feet. He heard a voice from within, a guard no doubt, saying, "There's something on the roof," followed by an electronic crackle of static. The guard was probably communicating to the driver via walkie-talkie. Fine. Let him call for help for all the good it would do to him. Sandman stared at his right arm, willed it into the shape he wanted it, and was pleased to see it reform into a giant sandstone mace. He raised it high and then slammed it down, tearing into the rear of the armored car and shredding it like tissue paper. The one guard inside looked up at him with a face that had gone the color of curdled milk. Then Sandman spotted what he'd been after. The huge sacks of bank cash piled into a corner like so much laundry. Jackpot. Sandman glanced back to the guard just in time to see the shotgun being pointed at him before it went off. He tried to avoid the blast out of reflex, and was only partly successful as the left side of his face was blown away. Howling in fury at the pain he didn't feel, Sandman let his cohesion go. The guard was instantly besieged by a tidal wave of sand, smashing him against the plexiglass partition that separated the cargo section of the truck from the cab. The driver turned, his eyes wide in alarm, as he saw the back section fill impossibly fast with cascading sand. The partition was designed to withstand direct shots from bullets, but not the sheer, unyielding amount of weight that was piling up against it now. A ribbon of cracks appeared in the plexiglass, and before the driver could think of what he should do, the partition shattered and sand gushed into the cab. The driver let out an alarmed shriek, but the sound was overwhelmed by the roar of Sandman's onslaught. Pouring into the cab without let-up, sand buried the driver up to his neck. It also buried his foot on the accelerator, pressing it to the floor. Even enveloped as he was by sand, the driver desperately fought to keep the armored car on course. He was only partly successful. The armored car careened wildly down the street, sending pedestrians scattering. A taxi veered to get out of its way, but the speeding truck dealt it a glancing blow and sent it skidding to the side. Sandman, meantime, had reformed part of his body into its human proportions, even as the rest of the sand kept the driver immobilized and the armored car moving. Only a short time earlier he had been so concerned about the safety of others in regard to flying bullets. But the more he used his power, the more he found such concerns to be quaint, even irrelevant. He had the power of a god, and what use did gods have for worrying about the safety of mere mortals? He could do anything now. Anything. A jaunty voice broke through his musings on omnipotence. "What sandbox did you crawl out of?" Sandman looked up and saw the masked face of Spider-Man staring down at him. The wall crawler was leaning against the rear doors of the armored car, apparently having dropped through the hole that Sandman had created. He had a cocky demeanor, like a blue and red clad Bugs Bunny, that immediately irritated the hell out of Sandman. "Don't you know there's a penalty for early withdrawal?" Spider-Man demanded. "Back off," snarled Sandman, and just to underscore how serious he was, he extended his arm and swung a sandy fist at Spider-Man. Moving faster than Sandman would have thought possible, Spider-Man ducked under it, punching Sandman in the gut. It had about as much effect as the cop's bullets. His fist went right through Sandman's body. Sandman instantly reacted, transforming his fist into the shape of a hammer and slamming Spider-Man not only into the truck's rear doors, but through them, tearing the doors right off their hinges. One of the doors clattered to the street and tumbled away. Spider-Man landed on top the other. The door, still moving at the same speed as the car, skidded and sent up a shower of sparks. The annoying insect fired a web line, and affixing his feet to the door with his astounding adhesive power, surfed down the street behind the car, dragging along at top speed. Other cars were scrambling to get out of the armored car's path. The armored car swerved, mowing through a line of parked cars, sending each of them flipping up and over, and Spider-Man had to surf left, right, left again, dodging the tumbling vehicles as they crashed down on either side of him. Sandman witnessed a van fly towards Spider-Man, who somersaulted over it and landed back on his still-moving wakeboard. A gremlin, of all things, now hurtled toward him end over end, and Spider-Man practically bent backward like a limbo dancer, allowing the car to pass harmlessly over him. Sandman admired Spider-Man's agility, if not his brains. Deciding that watching the wildly gyrating web-slinger had provided enough amusement for one day, Sandman climbed out of the top of the armored car, hauling as many of the cash bags as he could carry. Out the corner of his eye, he saw his pursuer suddenly vault from his makeshift wakeboard onto the top of the car, squaring off yet again in this ongoing and ridiculous attempt to impede him. Just ahead of the out-of-control armored vehicle, oblivious of the world around her, a woman crossed the street to her car while chatting away on a cell phone. She opened the driver's door of her parked car. The armored car was barreling straight at her. In about 5 seconds, there would be nothing between the hurtling truck and the open door of her car. She was standing directly under a lamppost. Without thought, Spider-Man fired a web line in a long arc that soared over the top of the lamppost, descended, and snagged her from behind. In the instant before the armored car struck, the web line drew shorter, and the startled woman was yanked upward. The armored truck smashed through the open car door, sending it flying with such impact that it landed a block away. The woman dropped to the ground seconds later, looking around dizzily, clearly uncertain as to what had just happened. Spider-Man was torn with conflict. Clearly this human sand pile had to be stopped. But so did the armored car before it killed someone, and at least he had some clue about how to go about that. Taking a huge risk, he dropped into the speeding armored car, ignoring the scowling face of the sand guy as he went. He spotted the one guard, pressed up against the shattered plexiglass, and the driver, who was buried up to his neck. Spider-Man also saw that the problem of stopping the armored car was about to be solved. It was heading toward the solid side of a building. With only seconds to act, he grabbed the one guard under one arm, hauled the driver out from the sand pile with the other, and threw them both out the back of the ruined car. Even as he did so, he spun web nets faster than ever before. They formed slings around the guards, snagging them both. Spider-Man was about to leap clear, when the leftover sand beneath his feet grabbed at him. He looked down in confusion, buried in sand up to his ankles. He tried to pull free, yanking with increasing desperation. Just as he managed to extricate his feet, the armored car hit the curb, flipped completely over, and slammed into the side of the building. Ironically, the pile of sand in the cab saved him. Spider-Man was propelled forward on impact, but all the sand in the front that had nearly smothered the driver cushioned the blow. The rest of the armored car crunched in behind him, and he tightened himself into a ball, tucking his head down for maximum protection. Even after the car had been halted in its suicidal course, Spider-Man stayed there for long seconds, scarcely able to believe he was still alive. His whole body ached, the world around him spinning. Hauling his battered body forward, hand over hand, Spider-Man pulled himself out the open back of the car and tumbled with a distinct lack of gracefulness into the street. The car was a smoking wreck, and a bit of flame burned on the underside. He snuffed it out with a few quick web shots. The last thing anyone needed was for the whole thing to erupt in a massive fireball. He looked over toward the guards just long enough to ascertain that they were all right. There was not, however, any sign of the money, nor of the sandy freak that had made off with it. Spider-Man immediately fired a web line that hauled him to a high perch, giving him an unobstructed view of the surrounding area for blocks in all directions. He tried to catch a glimpse of his opponent, but there was none to be had. He was long gone. He briefly pondered the insane opponents that had surfaced since the first day he had put on the Spider-Man costume. The Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, the Goblin Redux, and now this human sandpile. Where do all these guys come from? He wondered aloud, then grimly thought that the Daily Bugle was going to have a field day with this. Peter Parker couldn't have been more correct. The next day's Bugle headline blared, "Sandman, son of a beach. Even Spidey can't stop him." Even more irritating was the smaller headline, which had a picture of Spider-Man receiving the key to the city from Gwen Stacy, with the words, "Give back the key," plastered beneath it. Reading the front page in his apartment, Peter threw it down in irritation. Then he looked in the mirror, straightened his tie, and pulled on his sports jacket as he muttered, "It was a draw." He was still aching from the pounding he'd taken at the hands of the guy everyone was calling Sandman. An obvious enough name, and certainly appropriate since he'd come close to hammering Spider-Man into unconsciousness. But Peter healed quickly, and was determined to soldier through the pain for Mary Jane's sake. This was going to be an important evening, and he didn't want to risk anything ruining it. Pulling his wallet out of his jacket pocket, he checked the contents and wasn't thrilled. He went to a drawer where he kept what he laughingly referred to as the Parker family fortune and extracted a few more bills. He stared at it, looking at the money in his hand, then took the whole pile and shoved it in his pocket. From his other pocket, he extracted Aunt May's engagement ring. It was tiny, granted, but if he held it up just right in the light, it dazzled. As he headed for the door, he had a vague sense of unease. At first he thought it was simply butterflies in his stomach over his plans for the evening, but then something drew him to the closet. He glanced in and saw nothing except his sparse wardrobe in deep shadows. Peter supposed it was understandable that he was getting increasingly cautious in his old age. If sand could have it out for him, then it was entirely possible that, the next thing he knew, shadows would be out to get him. Laughing inwardly at the notion, Peter headed out the front door, shutting it tightly behind him, and never noticing that one of the shadows in his closet was moving ever so slightly. 12. Proposal on the Rocks. The Constellation restaurant was a reasonably upscale rendezvous that was within Peter's financial limits, albeit barely. Originally, Peter had been concerned that he wasn't going to be able to put thoughts of yesterday's debacle behind him, but was now pleasantly surprised to find an increasing spring in his step as he approached the restaurant. During evening hours, an elevator in the front lobby operated express from the ground floor to the Constellation, and Peter stepped into it feeling positively elated. Whatever shellacking his confidence might have taken at Sandman's hands yesterday was all washed away in a flood of good feeling that this evening would turn out well. Prompted by the cheery ding of the elevator, he stepped out on the top floor and glanced around with uncertainty. He'd never been to this restaurant before, but Mary Jane had spoken of it highly. This was supposed to be her night, and that was all the incentive he'd needed. A wandering violinist passed by, playing a sprightly rendition of Flight of the Bumblebee. Peter moved toward the reservation desk, where a maitre d' peered down his nose at him and said, "Bonsoir, le monsieur a-t-il une réservation?" I'm sorry, I don't speak." Peter was already feeling out of his depth. His eyes crinkling with carefully cultivated French disdain, the maitre d' reminded him, "This is a French restaurant, no?" "Oui." Heaving the sigh of one who does not suffer fools gladly, the maitre d' said, "Name, please?" "Parker. Peter." He skimmed down the list, then nodded. "Ah, here we are. Parker, for two. You're the first." "I have a request. My girlfriend will be coming. I have this." Peter fumbled around in his pocket and experienced a brief, horrified moment when he thought it had somehow discovered a hole and had slipped away, before his fingers finally settled around it. He withdrew Aunt May's engagement ring and held it up. "This ring. And I want to..." This seemed to cause the maitre d' to perk up. "You want to pop the question tonight?" "Right. I want to do something special." "Ah," said the maitre d', thumping his open hand to his chest as if he were trying to prevent his heart from bounding out of it. "I love it. Romance." He paused, then added, "I am French," as if that were in doubt. "When I signal you," Peter said in a conspiratorial tone, "if you bring the champagne with the ring at the bottom of her glass..." Peter gave him a high sign. "Perfect." "Magnifique," replied the maitre d'. And for good measure, he made one of those popping noises, like a champagne cork, by bouncing his hand off his mouth. "Also," said Peter, pulling a slip of paper from his inside jacket pocket, "I thought, at the same time, if the violins could play this song." The maitre d' glanced at it, and to Peter's relief, nodded in approval. Their favorite. Peter handed the ring to the maitre d', who held the diamond up for closer inspection. If he thought the size was unimpressive, he at least had enough discretion not to say anything about it. "Take good care of the ring," said Peter. "With my life, monsieur," the maitre d' solemnly intoned. He gestured for Peter to follow him to the table. "S'il vous plaît?" "Oui." Peter once again utilized one of the 4 French words he knew. It appeared to be enough. "I like you," said the maitre d', as he led Peter past other tables, where elegantly dressed, sophisticated diners were enjoying an evening out. 1 or 2 glanced his way, found nothing about him particularly remarkable, and went back to their conversations. A waiter quickly stepped in to pull Peter's chair back for him, which took Peter by surprise. In the places where he typically dined out, the most interaction he was used to from a server was a bored query of, "Do you want fries with that?" He sat down, and the waiter eased his chair in behind him. It was one of the most comfortable chairs that Peter had ever sat in. He watched the maitre d' move off, and noticed that a bread basket had been placed in front of him. At least he thought it was a bread basket. It was filled with artistically designed braided breads and unusual crackers. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to eat them or admire them from a distance. Glancing around, he saw that all the fashionable people seemed to be eating them, although, amazingly, there were no crumbs to be spotted anywhere. "You swing upside down on threads 80 stories above street level. You can be adventurous enough to have some bread." He picked up one of the braided sticks and bit into it carefully. It was wonderful, freshly baked. He waved the stick around in what he perceived was a casual manner, and imagined Mary Jane sitting across from him. "I ordered some champagne," he said, and realized he was speaking with a French accent. He cleared his throat and continued in his normal voice. "Would you like some champagne?" Then, pretending to see a ring in her glass, he acted surprised as he said, "Oh, how'd that get in there?" He smiled, seeing her getting teary-eyed. "Oh, stop. Don't cry." He acted out the rest of the scenario to his satisfaction, then glanced at his wrist only to discover that he wasn't wearing a watch. Well, that was all right. Certainly she'd be along any minute. Time passed, and more time, until he lost track. He was munching on the last of the breadsticks and growing concerned. The notion that Mary Jane might be standing him up never occurred to him. Instead, he was entirely concerned that, well, who knew what? What if Harry had gotten his memory back and was holding her hostage somewhere? What if she'd run afoul of this Sandman character? What if... With great relief, he saw Mary Jane finally enter the restaurant and speak a few words to the maitre d'. The maitre d' nodded, looking rather pleased, and led Mary Jane over to the table. Peter thought she looked a little self-conscious, but he could understand why. A girl as gorgeous as Mary Jane was always having people looking her way with admiration. It had to be hard drawing appreciative stares wherever you went. Peter politely rose as the maitre d' personally held the chair out for her. She sat down and shifted uneasily, which seemed odd to Peter since there was nothing remotely uncomfortable about the chair. "This place in your budget?" she asked. "Ah, that was it. Money worries." Peter smiled reassuringly and said, "It's a special occasion. You're on Broadway. You're a star." "I don't feel like much of a star tonight." "You're a star in my eyes. You'll be in everyone's eyes now." When she didn't react to that, he reached over and took her hand. "I know what you're feeling, but you'll get used to it. Take me. I'm everywhere." He laughed at the absurdity of it. "I see Spider-Man posters in the windows, kids running around with me on their sweaters. I'm a big Halloween item." He saw a trace of a smile on Mary Jane's mouth over that, and, feeling encouraged, continued. "I don't know, I guess I've become something of an icon. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, they kept screaming it. I mean, come on, I'm a nerdy kid from Queens. So I'm thinking to myself, do I deserve this?" He hoped he was taking the right approach to the situation. Last time, Mary Jane had flipped out on him when he'd started addressing her concerns from his point of view. But he was certain that the way to get through to her now was to make her understand that he could relate to her problems through personal experience. Still, he didn't know how much headway he was making here, and he was about to pursue her worries further, when suddenly he saw exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong time heading their way. "Hi, Peter," called a cheerful Gwen Stacy. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Of all the restaurants in all the boroughs in all New York, she had to walk into mine." Peter was suddenly self-conscious. That spur-of-the-moment kiss that had seemed like such a good idea at the time now left Peter feeling extremely vulnerable. Here he'd made this whole big demonstration on the stage, and now the girl with whom he performed it was standing there smiling at him, and Mary Jane, to whom he was preparing to propose, could only scowl. At that moment, Peter would have welcomed an attack from the Sandman just to defuse the situation. "Oh, Gwen, hi." He tried not to project anything in his tone or demeanor that might suggest he was doing anything other than politely acknowledging her presence. "My parents and I were just having dinner here, and I saw you guys." Gwen pointed toward the doorway, and Peter saw a man and woman waiting there. They had their coats on, obviously about to leave. They must have been dining on the opposite side of the restaurant, and Gwen had spotted Peter as they were on their way out. It took him a few seconds, but then he recognized the man. The police captain who had been at the scene when he saved Gwen. Her father is a cop? A trained observer of people who could tell when someone was uncomfortable or lying or trying to conceal something? Oh, this is just perfect. Gwen's parents waved to them, and Peter waved back. Immediately, the maitre d', mistaking Peter's gesture for his signal, started toward Peter with the champagne. Peter's eyes widened in panic, and he quickly waved the maitre d' off. This caused the maitre d' to stop where he was, blinking in confusion like a blinded owl. Meantime, Gwen's parents, equally bewildered, continued to wave. While Peter flapped like a crippled sparrow, Gwen seized the initiative and extended a hand to Mary Jane. "Hello, I'm Gwen Stacy." Realizing that the two hadn't formally been introduced, Peter quickly said, "Oh, right, this is, To his horror, he blanked on her name for a split second, but quickly recovered and said, "Mary Jane Watson." "Hi, it's so nice to meet you," Gwen said warmly. "Pete talks about you all the time." Mary Jane raised a single eyebrow. Never a good sign. "Oh?" Clearing his throat, Peter said, "Gwen's my, lab partner in Dr. Connor's class." Gwen rested a hand on his shoulder, A simple, friendly gesture. From the look on Mary Jane's face, though, Gwen might as well have been sliding her hand down the front of his shirt. "Peter's something of a genius," Gwen said blithely. "He saved my life in chemistry." "Uh-huh. Oh, this is so not good." "Oh, and Pete, something else before I forget," Gwen continued, still unaware of the rapidly dropping temperature in the air. "You're Spider-Man's personal photographer, right?" Peter was about to say that wasn't exactly true, but Gwen went right on. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but if you manage to get a shot of our kiss, I'd love it. For my portfolio, of course." She laughed lightly and said to Mary Jane, "After all, who gets kissed by Spider-Man these days?" Mary Jane didn't even glance at Gwen. Instead, her gaze was boring through the back of Peter's head as she said icily, "I can't imagine." The loud clattering noise in Peter's head was the sound of the wheels coming completely off the evening. Gwen threatened to keep talking, but then finally, in the brief silence that followed Mary Jane's comment, she realized Peter was hugely uncomfortable, and Mary Jane was steaming about something. Trying damage control, she said with a desperate smile, "I'll leave you two alone. Loved meeting you." As she started to leave, she called over her shoulder, "By the way, try the rack of lamb. We just love the rack of lamb here." MJ nodded distractedly, her gaze still fixed on Peter. The eyebrow was still raised. Clearly, she was waiting for him to say something. "She's in my science class. It's not her best subject." Gwen and her parents waved one final time as they headed out the door. Peter threw a fast wave back and returned his attention to Mary Jane. As a result, he didn't notice that the maitre d' yet again mistook the gesture as the real summons for the champagne. Mary Jane still studied Peter as if he were a slide on a microscope. "Rack of lamb," he asked, doing his best to sound casual and failing miserably. "Do we like lamb?" Still nothing. Not only had the wheels gone off the evening, it was now skidding out of control toward a cliff, apparently without enough webbing in the world to yank it up short. "What?" he finally asked, exasperation rising within him. "How come you've never mentioned her?" MJ demanded, and it all came out in a rush. "She's your lab partner, you saved her life, she thinks you're a genius, and she had her polished fingernails all over you? Or didn't you notice? And she gave Spider-Man the key to the city. I'll never forget that." Peter couldn't believe it. What the hell had gotten into her? Mary Jane was acting insanely jealous. Over a kiss and Gwen being friendly at a restaurant and a meaningless ceremony, for crying out loud. Had Mary Jane's confidence been that shattered by one lousy review? How in the world was she going to survive as an actress, a person, if she was that thin-skinned? And, in truth, Peter was reaching a point where he really wasn't appreciating getting the 3rd degree. He worked to keep an edge out of his voice, not wanting to exacerbate matters, as he said steadily, "She's a girl in my class." As if he hadn't spoken, and for all he knew she hadn't even heard him, she leaned forward and said, "Let me ask you something. When you kissed her, who was kissing her? Spider-Man or Peter?" "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean. That was our kiss." Oh, jeez. What a lunkhead he'd been. It wasn't so much the kiss as that Mary Jane felt something personal had been displayed in a very public forum. Peter had never given that aspect any thought, and he obviously should have. He tried to explain that he now understood and was deeply apologetic, but Mary Jane wouldn't let him get a word in. "Why would you do that? You must have known how it would make me feel. Do you want to push me away?" "Why would I push you away? I love you. You're my girlfriend." When she continued to stare at him with no further comment, he repeated, "She's just a girl in my class, MJ." "I guess I thought you were going to..." "What? Propose? Apologize? Grow up? Give me 30 seconds and I can do all 3. Instead, she rose from her seat. "It doesn't matter. I don't feel very well. I have to go. I'm sorry." "Hey, wait a minute," he protested. Don't do that. Too late. She was already headed away from the table. Please don't follow me, she snapped. The only thing that would have kept Mary Jane there was Peter firing webbing at her feet and gluing her in place, something he was strongly considering. Peter started to go after her despite her wishes to the contrary, and his path was suddenly blocked by two violinists playing Falling in Love. When he had imagined the way he thought this evening was going to go, Mary Jane had heard the tune and promptly burst into song, accompanying them. Instead, she looked as if she were about to burst into tears the moment the first notes of the song sounded. She walked faster, so fast that she bumped into a table, staggered, and nearly knocked a tray out of a waiter's grasp. All eyes in the restaurant turned toward her, and the moment she was out the door, they shifted toward Peter. The violinists came in on either side of Peter and serenaded him with his song, which he was now quite certain was going to be a tune he would never be able to stand listening to again. He thought he heard a long, high-pitched scream, and he realized that, yes indeed, that was the sound of the evening clearing the edge of the cliff and hurtling down toward its hideous death. Holding the champagne glasses and oblivious to how badly things had gone, the maitre d' said politely, "May I tell you tonight's specials?" Without a word, Peter reached into one of the champagne glasses, removed the ring, picked up a napkin, and carefully wiped it off. Meantime, the maitre d' was prattling on. "We have the watercress soup with an accent of tarragon. We have the fresh crab in a marinara sauce, roast beef with a spark of ginger, and the foie gras conception." At that moment, Peter wanted nothing more than to be invisible to simplify slinking out of here. As the violins continued to play their admittedly beautiful rendition of Falling in Love, Peter placed the ring in his pocket, picked up one of the champagne glasses, and tossed back the drink in one gulp. It burned in a pleasant manner as it hurtled down his throat. It was the only thing about the entire evening that had gone down according to plan. Peter tried to contact Mary Jane several times upon arriving home and got no answer. He hated having to stand there in the middle of the hallway and use the payphone, but he had no choice. Money was too tight for him to spend it on a private phone, or even a cell. "Hello? Mary Jane? Are you there? It's me. I want to talk to you. Come on, Mary Jane, pick up." When he realized she wasn't going to, he hung up with a heavy sigh. It was too late. She'd probably gone to the theater. As he turned to head into his apartment, the payphone suddenly rang. Daring to hope that it was Mary Jane, that maybe the evening could be salvaged, he grabbed it off the hook. He did so with such energy that, had it not been for his adhesive abilities, the receiver would have flown out of his hand. "Hello?" he asked, making no attempt to keep the urgency out of his voice. "Mr. Parker," came a gravelly male voice from the other end, and Peter, crestfallen, was certain that it was a bill collector. So he was surprised when the voice continued, "This is Detective Neil Garrett from the 32nd Precinct. I'm calling on behalf of Captain Stacy. He'd like you to come down to the station to speak with him." Oh my God, he knows. He was able to tell from across the restaurant. I'm dead. I'm so dead. "What's..." Peter's voice cracked slightly, and he brought it back under control. "What's it about?" "We've got some new information regarding the homicide of your uncle, Ben Parker." Peter had always thought it looked odd or unrealistic in the movies when someone stared at a phone in his or her hand upon the receipt of shocking news. Peter's real-life reaction, though, was nothing short of Oscar-worthy, as he stared stupidly at the plastic receiver, his mind reeling, his body paralyzed. Ran toward him with some sort of large plastic device on his wrist, a lever attached to a canister. Oh shit, I remember that. There's still silly string on the garage from when we were messing with that. That was years ago. Shit, blast from the past. Thank you for that run-on sentence, Mr. David. I'm sure your $20.99 comics are great, but yikes. My jaw feels tight. Yeah. Gotta give Tara Strong a call, see if I can Yes, I have Tara Strong on speed dial. I've already made it to that stage of my acting career. Hi, Tara. I noticed you're making millions of dollars in cash right now. Do you think you got me in blah? I'm so glad I'm not using this. I want to do something special. Ah, you wish to tap that ass, no? Sorry. Gwen continued, still unaware of the rapidly dropping temperature in the air, as well as his chances of getting laid, but I digress. Speaking of shattered confidence, somewhere there's an astronaut who's contemplating suicide after being left at the altar by, guess who?